So welcome everybody, and it's with great pleasure that we can welcome today Victoria Basualdo from Argentina. Victoria is a historian. She has been studying abroad for quite some time. I get from your CV because you did your master, MPhil, and PhD at Columbia University in New York. And you are now a researcher at CONICET, which is the National Council for Scientific and Technological Research in Argentina. And you coordinate at this moment a program of studies on labor, trade union movement, and industrial organization at the FLACSO, and within the FLACSO at the area of economics and technology. And I think you also coordinate another project on, or this is the one you are presenting about, or I don't know, you coordinate so many projects. So anyway, it's that is about the employers' participation in the repression of the workers and unionists during the dictatorship in Latin America. And of course, you have a lot of publications. I cannot go through all of them, but the key topics are indeed the employer's responsibility and violation of human rights in the dictatorship, but also contemporary history of the working class and the union movement in Argentina and Latin America more broadly, and technological change and labor relations more generally. One of your last publication is an edited volume published by Palgrave, and the title is Big Business and Dictatorship in Latin America and Transnational History of Profit and Repression, which says it all. Or not all, because we are going to hear more about this with this lecture that starts whenever you are ready, with the title Repression Against the Labor Movement in the Cold War, Dictatorships in Latin America, Military and Business Responsibility in Human Rights Violations in the Case of Argentina, 1976-1983. The floor is yours, so please tell us. And we will then, of course, discuss after your presentation. And we hope also that other colleagues will join the conversation with questions on curiosities or connections with their research, etc. Please, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's really nice to see you again after all the projects and books that we've shared. And I thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I know these are busy times, as always, and it's not easy to make time to be here and to share others' research. So I'm very happy to be here today. I'm going to present to you, and I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you are looking at it right now. I want to share with you some of the research we've been making with several colleagues. What I'm going to present is by no means an individual research, and that's one point I want to make about repression against the labor movement in Cold War dictatorships in Latin America. And as Christian was anticipating, we are very interested in trying to understand some of the articulation between the military forces and business sectors in human rights violations in the dictatorships during the Cold War, and particularly in Argentina. As Christian said, I'm a historian. I work in Argentina at FLACSO, la Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales. Here I coordinate a program that deals not only with the history of the working class and the labor movement, but also recent trends, which is also atypical in Argentina. Here, the field of history is very much devoted to quite past processes and not so much to the present. No, so maybe many times I get the, what are you from sociology? Because there's a division of labor between history and sociology in that term. Well, I consider that it's very interesting to try to see how the impact of these issues, connects with a more recent history as well. So first of all, I'm going to try to share with you some recent developments regarding the academic and scientific research about repression against the labor movement in the Cold War dictatorships in Latin America. I will be talking mainly about South America, but I'm going to refer to, Christian was referring to the last book, and in this last book, we make a connection also with Central America, which I think is quite important. So I'm going to just mention it in passing, but I think here the concentration on South America is something to be developed and articulated with other regions, no? And in second place, I'm going to try to bring to you some other connections that are not very common either. No, I was discussing the connection between the, I don't know, somewhat recent history and current trends in terms of the labor movement. That's not very common. But the other thing that it's not very common either is the connection between research and the process of, we call the process of memory, truth, and justice in Argentina, which is the process of trying to cope with this legacy of repression and severe violation of human rights that we had during several dictatorships, but especially during the last dictatorship that started in 1976 and ended in 1983 in Argentina. So I'm going to first devote some minutes to talk about historiography, about labor movement, dictatorships, and repression. But then I'm going to try to show you the ways in which we are connecting this academic and scientific research with the judiciary process and with the process of memory and truth as well. No? Well, first, I want to just to devote a couple of minutes because it's quite difficult to do it broadly and in depth as we should. But when we discuss the Cold War, generally Latin America hasn't had a very important role. So it's only recent in the last, I don't know, 2 decades that the Cold War historiography has been starting to focus on Latin America and trying to think a time frame, a chronology that fits into the region, that is not only following North American chronologies or European chronologies, but the Latin American time frame and moments. Of course, there's one particular moment which was crucial in the Cold War, which is the Cuban Revolution, that changed the Latin American sphere, that changed Latin American history and introduced many changes in terms of political radicalization in many of the countries. And the narrative when talking about the Cold War in Latin America tends to concentrate and to focus on these political aspects of political radicalization, of guerrillas, of the attempts of regime change, and the repression as responding to this political organization and history, no? Of course, when we see the Cold War in Latin America, what we see is a series of dictatorships. Here we see just an art demonstration of this. We have Paraguay in 1954, the dictatorship of Stroessner, Brazil in 1964, Bolivia in 71, Uruguay, here they say 72, but we consider today that it's 73, Chile in 73, and Argentina in 1976. And these are only some of the dictatorships in Latin America. In Argentina, we had 3 dictatorships during the Cold War, in 55 and 66, that are in the middle, and we only have here the 76, no? But this artifact that a group called Grupo de Artistas Callejeros try to put together demonstrates the way in which these dictatorships in Latin America are connected with each other, no? And there's a lot of research about this, which I think it's very interesting. Here I bring you only one of the aspects and one of the research done by Francesca Lessa. She's a scholar from Italy, but spent a lot of time in Latin America, particularly in Argentina and Uruguay. And here she is showing the ways in which these countries are connected, because we are seeing here, and I don't know why the title, you're not seeing the title over there, but it says repressive actions committed across borders in Latin America. So what we are seeing here is the connection between the repressive processes in Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina by means of the Condor project or Condor plan that articulated the military sectors in all these countries. And these are kidnappings and violations of human rights committed across borders, you know. So many of the crimes committed in Argentina were of Uruguayan nationals, Chilean nationals, Paraguayan, and so on. No? And this work by Francesca Lessa tried to take into account these regional dimensions of dictatorships in Latin America, and tried to analyze the connections between the repressive policies among them, using many archives over there. No, there were 2 trials about the Condor project in Latin America, the Condor plan, one trial in Argentina and the other one in Italy. And these are criminal trials that established these connections across borders and the coordination of the military apparatuses in this region. I now want to go to Argentina, no? From this general introduction about Latin America, and to try to say that this idea of connecting the different dictatorships has been done mainly focusing on political aspects of this history. In Argentina, what we see is that from early on, from the 80s, there were attempts to try to see that the dictatorships were relevant, not only in terms of repression, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the consequences of this repression in these countries, and particularly in Argentina, but that we should understand the processes of repression in connection with economic, social, and labor changes. This is significant because up to now, we were discussing the Cuban Revolution, the radicalization of sectors of societies, the social and political struggle in many of these countries. But now we have to introduce new actors into this history, and we need to take into account first the transformations, the economic structural transformations carried out by these dictatorships. Here we have bibliography specifically in Argentina. So one of the main figures in terms of economic policy was José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz, the name you see over here, but also the role of the working class in this history. No? So it started to become evident that in order to study these dictatorships that were connected and had processes of repression interconnected with each other, they also had in common that they introduced different structural transformations, and they targeted the labor movement. No? And this is something that it was not evident from the beginning, because the predominant narrative was at first that the armed forces were trying to stop guerrillas, were trying to stop other countries to become Cuba, and to experience this revolutionary process. Of course, we know that in Cuba, there was a national revolution, but shortly after, it became a country affiliated with the USSR, with the Soviet Union. And of course, there was a huge concern about this political radicalization and possible regime change. But also, it emerged a second narrative, which was not alternative. I mean, it's not one or the other, but instead interconnected, trying to understand what was going on in all these Latin American countries in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, with regards to labor rights, the role of the labor movement, and the dispute over the economic projects to lead the country. No? So here we have bibliography from the field of economics, but also from the field of labor history. and institutional history, that showed that there was, in this case, we are talking about Argentina, and then we are going to go back to Latin America, that there was a huge connection between dictatorships and economic transformations towards neoliberal policies in Latin America. This was, I don't know, in Argentina, there was a huge turning point out after the 2000s, and particularly in 2003, because there was a huge change in terms of human rights policies from that moment onwards. I'm going to go back to this chronology of the process of memory, truth, and justice. But in 2003, there was a turning point that allowed some things that I think were crucial. First, many archives were opened. Before, archives of many kinds, and particularly of economic institutions that had been in direct contact with the dictatorships, such as the National Commission of Values, for example, which was a key institution during the dictatorship, the central bank, the national bank, many economic institutions that before closed completely their archives started to open them and allowed to confirm many of the findings that had been assessed before with regards to the close connections between military leaders and some economic figures in this process. I would like to emphasize the importance of this book, Cuentas Pendientes, you see over there, which is Outstanding Debts, that was published afterwards by Cambridge University Press, that, summarizes the findings of 25 experts in many different directions, trying to analyze the connections between the business community and the military leaders in this period of the dictatorship, and analyzing many aspects of funding, the role of the Catholic Church, and some even networks, financing networks close to the Vatican, but also the role of many corporate institutions at the time with the dictatorship. But here we come, in the case of Argentina, to a book that I want to present to you very briefly because we don't have a lot of time, but I will try to make my best. Between 2014 and 2015, a team of nearly 20 specialists came together from different institutions, from academia, the place in which I work, the area of economic and technologies at FLACSO, a human rights organization, which is CELS, El Centro de Estudios Legales y Sociales, and two state programs, the Program of Truth and Justice and the Secretary of Human Rights, brought together 20 specialists to try to analyze one specific issue in this connection between business leaders, corporate organizations, and the military leadership. And this research focused specifically on 25 companies. Here you see the logos of some of them, and here we see them geographically located in Argentina. What we analyzed, I was part of this project, and I was part of the coordination board of this research project. We analyzed 25 companies throughout the country, and here you will find some familiar names, such as, for example, Ford or Mercedes-Benz or Fiat, or even the Tint Group, which is from Italy and Argentina. So we investigated, we researched these 25 cases throughout the country, trying to analyze not the military and business connections in general, intellectual relationships, institutional relationships. I don't know how some military figures became key officials in the dictatorship. All of these are valid connections. We also found that there were many economic connections. There was funding given by the military to specific companies, and some of them became very concentrated in their economic activities and constituted economic groups with many companies throughout the dictatorship. All of that was very interesting, but we were focusing on one specific matter, which was the kind of involvement that these companies had in repression. So we were dealing here not with a very, I don't know, general or intellectual, institutional, economic relationships, but with the articulation between the armed forces and corporate sectors in political repression within their companies. In order to do that, we worked with many archives. Here we have some photos, very small in terms of the sources we analyzed, but you have the National Archive of Memory over there, which holds documentation about the dictatorship, which is very important. You have over there the commission, the Provincial Commission of Memory, which holds the archive of the intelligence done by police of the province of Buenos Aires. This is an intelligence archive which is of immense value. And we have here the General Archive of the Nation in Argentina that holds also a lot of important document collections relevant to this project. But also we, of course, worked with press documentation, press sources, and oral interviews, provincial archives, the Ministry of Labor, the Defense Ministry archives. I don't know. It was a very extensive and profound work of 2 years, during which we analyzed these 25 cases, and we tried to analyze them in terms of their specific characteristics. Here we have, and going back, we have sugar mills, for example, we have transportation companies, automobile companies, steel mills, we have shipyards, industrial companies, production of ceramics, and of course I forgot to mention Swift as a company that you would also know instantly, food industry companies, cement companies, and also graphic. And I don't know, it was not only a graphic company, but a multimedia companies such as La Nueva Provincia. So, and here we have Las Marias, which is a yerba mate and tea company in Corrientes, in the northeast of the country. So we have many economic activities. We have different regions of the country involved over here. We have different ownership and origin of these companies. Some of them are multinationals, some of them are local. And what we found is that it was very important to try to analyze all of these cases, each of them specifically, trying to analyze the trajectory of the company, the history of trade union and labor organization, and the main processes of transformation of that, the process of repression in each of these companies, whether or not there have been violence over there, in which sense, how many of the workers were kidnapped over there. Overall, in the 25 companies we analyzed, over 900 workers were kidnapped during the dictatorship. In some of the cases, the kidnapped were above 100, for example, in Fiat. And in some other country, and in some other cases, there were between 50 and 70, and in some other cases, 20 or 30 in each company. But we have cases of several kidnappings and groups of workers kidnapped in all of them, no? And what we found also, besides these specific characteristics and the need to try to analyze each of the cases in depth and considering this specific evolution, what we saw is at the same time that there were common patterns in the 25, no? When looking at these 25 cases all together, we found out that in 88% of these 25 cases, there were kidnappings of workers at the shop floor. So these workplaces were, I don't know, a place of repression themselves, It's not that there were many workers kidnapped, but related to something else, but within the chain of production, which was significant, and I'm going to talk about a little bit more when I discuss one of these cases that was, that became an object of an oral proceedings and became a trial that is emblematic up to now. So 88%, in 88% of these 25 cases, we found kidnappings at the shop floor. In 76%, we had disclosure of private information of workers and list of activists and shop floor representatives to the armed forces. In over the half of the cases, we found presence of corporate officials and employees in kidnappings and even in cases of torture. In almost the half of the cases, we found economic and financial contributions to the armed forces in repression, in charge of repression. In 40% of the cases, we found the use of vehicles of the companies for the process of repression, and 36% of the cases, explicit requests from the business officials to the military personnel of specific workers. And in 32%, the kidnapping of workers on the way between the house and the workplace, which in Argentina, of course, is included in the working day or in the process. If you have an accident in the traject between your place and the work, of course, it's included in corporate responsibility. And I want to refer to this specific issue. Of course, this happened in a context of militarization of these workplaces, the presence of military personnel within the factories, in many cases controlling the entrance to the factory, in many cases in charge of labor relations, in many cases military personnel was incorporated into the board of the companies. In many cases, we found connections of intelligence officials within the company, reporting to both the military and the business leadership at the same time. Well, the process of militarization was also very wide and important. But I want to just briefly mention this. In 5 of the 25 cases we researched, we found that there were clandestine spaces of detention and torture within the property of the companies. And this is the case of Asindar. This is the case, which is a steel mill company in the province of Santa Fe. This is the case of Ford in Pacheco, province of Buenos Aires. This is the case of La Veloz del Norte, which is a transportation company of Salta, Argentina. This is the case of the Fronterita, which is a sugar mill in the province of Tucumán. And this is the case also of the shipyard Astilleros Río Santiago in Ensenada, province of Buenos Aires. So in 5 of the 25 cases, what we found is that not only there were these kind of contributions we were discussing before, this infrastructure, material, and information that was crucial for the process of repression, but also there were clandestine centers of detention within the properties, within the site of the companies, no? And this brings us back to try to understand why and how this happened, because it's not common. I mean, we are talking about extraordinary evidence, extraordinary cases. I mean, it doesn't make sense for companies to get involved this deep into military repression. I mean, as a company, supposedly you want to obtain profits and you want to do your work, no? So we are talking here about extreme corporate behavior that, of course, is tremendously troubling. And of course, it relates these findings and all this research with the research about other processes, historical processes of dictatorial authoritarian regimes and the relationship with companies, no? And some of the companies are the same that we were discussing we are discussing right now, no? In the case of Brazil, I'm going to refer briefly to Volkswagen, but here we are referring to Mercedes-Benz, no? So we are discussing, and Ford, and of course, and Fiat also. So we are discussing companies that have been in this situation and in this position before. But it's quite, I think historically, it's quite difficult to try to understand how this happened. And I think it's closely related to the main issue I was talking at the beginning. I was talking about at the beginning. That is the importance to put into the picture the labor movement and the trade union action in Latin America in the 50s to the 70s, no? So what we find, and here you have the main strikes, mobilizations, and demonstrations doing by working class and student movements in Argentina from the late 60s to the 70s. And you see all of this all over the country, no? All of the points that you see are cities and populations that got mobilized. And here you see the victims of these processes of repression of these movements, no? So clearly in order to understand the concern of these big companies, you have to combine the analysis of the processes of political radicalization in Latin America and the story we know about the guerrillas and the Cuban Revolution and the creation of many political movements that consider that Cuba was an example and that maybe your problems could be resolved by means of seizing power and mobilizing people and staging a revolution. But at the same time, you have to take into account labor struggle, which tends to become out of the picture as something, I don't know, not very important, not very relevant, somewhat somewhat not troubling, not a powerful force. That instead, I would argue that the connection between labor struggle and political organization, political protest, was very powerful at the time. And was at the center of this concern that drove these companies to get directly involved in repression. Of course, this happens, and I wanted to introduce this also because I was referring to these cases. We have to place these companies that acted, that had some spaces within them as spaces of detention. We have to place them within this context of extreme repression during the 1976-83 dictatorship in Argentina. Of course, we have an estimated number of 30,000 disappeared people, tens of thousands of political prisoners, and hundreds of thousands that went to exile, no, or that moved internally within the country. But here we have over 800 places that have been identified by the authorities as clandestine centers of detention throughout Argentina during the dictatorship. Some of them even in schools, you know, some of them were placed even in schools and with very, very tragic histories and characteristics that I don't have time to see. What this implies is to see that these confrontations from the civil society that happened within the dictatorship that were very important, and here we have the Madres of Plaza de Mayo, the mothers of the disappeared, no? And we have also the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, the abuelas, an organization that was created to demand the return of the kids that had been kidnapped, sometimes with their parents when they had been born, but sometimes they had been born in captivity. No, their mothers had given birth during the process of kidnapping, and these babies, and there are over 300 proven cases of abducted kids that today, of course, they are all adults, that are being searched by the abuelas, the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo, because they don't know their identity. You know, they have been raised by military personnel or police-related personnel, and their identity has been hidden up to now. So this crime continues happening until today. Of course, the human rights organizations were very important during the dictatorship, but also the trade union and labor movement. And this trend of research allow us to see also this kind of mobilization that was not part of the narrative of the dictatorship for a long time. I mean, and of course, the focus was on these human rights movements, which were central. Here we have the Foundation of Cells, the organization I was discussing before, and here we have different protests, and also the arrival of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in 1979, which was one of the international missions during the dictatorship, verifying what had happened. But also there's another very important process of trade union and labor protest within the country and abroad as well. The ILO, for example, was a main arena of denunciation of what was happening in the dictatorship in Argentina. And there was a lot of international solidarity in different countries in Latin America, also in Europe, in the US. There was a huge trade union network and movement that hasn't been acknowledged. And in this context, many of the loss of rights I was referring to before, many of the change of labor conditions and the change in terms of wages level, the dictatorship implies a huge structural transformation in Argentina, which is not the case throughout Latin America. We have different cases and different depths of transformation. Chile was a very neoliberal project, and Brazil not so much. There was a project that was more gradual and has different characteristics. But here in Argentina, we had a very strong process of economic transformation during the dictatorship, with an increase of external debt, with a loss of participation in the national income distribution on the part of workers, reduced to the half of the previous participation during the crisis that led to the end of the dictatorship in 1982. So these marches and demonstrations are not only protesting repression, but they are also protesting the loss of labor rights, the decrease of wages, the increase of unemployment in some activities, such as industrial activities, which was not open unemployment immediately, but it was very important in terms of the labor movement history. And we have a huge confrontation about these structural transformations I was referring to before. So all this research in Argentina opened the path of the discussion of the dictatorship in a different way, you know, with a different character, not only repression, but also all of these we are discussing. And this had also repercussions. This happened not only in Argentina, but in many other cases, no? So we have research, very important research in Brazil, for example. Here I show you only one book by Fernando Teixeira da Silva, which is a very important book about how the Brazilian working class was demanding rights in labor courts before the dictatorship, and how to understand the dictatorship, you have to go back and you have to see how this labor movement was being transformed and was gaining space and rights before the dictatorship, and how this was countered by this offensive. No, here I show you another book, Mundos do Trabalho e Ditaduras no Cone Sul, that was coordinated by Alejandra Esteves, Jan Sales, Larissa Rosa Correa, and Paulo Fontes. And these are very, very important scholars, also researching different aspects about the dictatorship, such as the state of the labor movement and the importance of migration from the Northeast in Brazil to the main industrial centers, in the case of Paulo Fontes. And in the case of Larissa, she made a huge contribution about the international trade union relations and the importance of the debate about how the trade union should act, what the trade union should be, no? And the importance of these social subjects, social agents that had been omitted before, no? And the same can we say with the dossier Trabajadores y Dictadura in the important journal Mundo do Trabalho. And the same we can say about Chile. Here I'm showing you one very important book by Peter Wynne, edited in 2004, that analyzed this Chilean dictatorship from the viewpoint of workers, no? And the title is quite clever, Victims of the Chilean Miracle, because as in Brazil, many times those defending the dictatorships talk about the economic miracles that happened during the dictatorships, both in Chile and Brazil. In Argentina, nobody says that because the economic evolution was too bad to be defended by anyone. But in the case of Chile, what Wynne is showing with many essays over there in this book that combines class and gender, and is very interesting and opened a path of research that was very interesting. They showed the other face of the dictatorship, no? The labor reform, the atomization of the trade union movement, the precarization of labor relations, the privatization of many sectors during the dictatorships, and many of the legacies that are under discussion in Chile and up to today, no? And the same with this book about Rodrigo Aracha Gomez, that analyzed the international campaign developed by some of the trade unions and the importance of this international articulation that I was referring to before. And besides these contributions about the labor movement, we also have an increasing historiography about the role of employers and corporate actors in Latin America. And here we have a book about Uruguay, El negocio del terrorismo de Estado, the business of state terrorism in Uruguay, the economic accomplices of the Uruguayan dictatorship, coordinated by Juan Pablo Boslaski, with a prologue by Catherine Seeking, which is very interesting in terms of trying to piece together these economic transformations related to the dictatorship that we were discussing before in the case of Argentina. Well, here we have it in the case of Uruguay. Also in the case of Chile, this book is translated into English, and it's great. It's very, very important. Economic complicity with the Chilean dictatorship, a country unequal by force. Many historians over there are made an important contribution. We have many dossiers. Here we have a dossier that coordinated from Argentina and Brazil. And this book that was mentioned by Christian before, Big Business and Dictatorships in Latin America, which I think I just brought you here a summary of this book, because I think it shows you some of this important historiography that is being developed about the whole region, and not only South America, not only these countries I was mentioning before, but also including Central America, done by a specialist, by a very important scholar, Marcelo Buccelli. Also the case of Colombia by Stefano Tejerina, the case of Peru by Monsalve Zanatti and Puerta Alarcón, the two studies about Chile, two very, very good studies about Chile, one study about the financial sector and the funding of these dictatorships, 3 studies about Brazil, 3 studies about Argentina, and 1 about Uruguay. And all of these coordinated with a very important contribution by Hartmut Berghoff from Göttingen University in Germany, which I think it's very interesting in trying to build bridges about the studies about the Nazi Germany and business over there, and the recent studies about Latin America. So with this, I was just trying to give you a very brief idea. Of course, I'm forgetting some other very important bibliography that I was about to omit. It was a crime on my part. And I'm referring to the very important role played by Lee Payne, Gabriel Pereira, and Laura Bernal Bermudez, and the study about transitional justice and corporate accountability from below. They worked on all of the truth commissions around the world, and they studied the ways in which this issue of corporate responsibility is starting to gain importance and weight within the work of these commissions throughout the world. No, not only in Latin America, but in all of the regions of the world. And also we have here a book about Colombia, which is another case, very important case in terms of business involvement in human rights violations. Even when we don't have a dictatorship in Colombia, the last dictatorship was that studied by Stefano Tejerina, which is in the 50s. You have it over there, no? But in Colombia, since the 50s, you don't have a dictatorship in the 60s and 70s as we have in many other countries. And in spite of that, you have a huge process of repression with corporate involvement over there. So here we have some of the recent books by some of the networks working on this, international networks that we are building about these issues. And I would try to make, I have only a few minutes left. So I will have to make sure to, I don't know, to run a little bit. But here I wanted to try to make some points. First, how to do this research. You need to build connections with the victims and with the actors of these processes. And trade unions themselves and human rights organizations have a lot of knowledge, archival documentation, evidence, and also testimonies that are very important. So to build this academic field with these social actors was key. The other thing is that you don't see this process unless you see it regionally and internationally, and you understand some of the logics behind which exceed completely the national boundaries. So I think it's all this transformation of this academic sphere I'm discussing here is essential if we want to try to understand this process. And the other point that I want to make is that, as Lee Payne and her team always stress, there should be a connection between the studies about transitional justice and dictatorships and all these processes of memory, truth, and justice in the past, and the field of business and human rights in the present. The field of business and human rights, which is very strong in United Nations and in many international organizations today, because of course corporate organizations are a major actor in all of these, and they violate several human rights today in many senses. I mean, the ecological concerns, demographic concerns, territorial impact, also labor relations are quite a concern for many human rights organizations today. There's kind of a disconnection between the studies about the past and the present. No, so business and human rights is all about attracting business and establishing a dialogue, and not about the outstanding debts, you know, and you do have processes that need to be dealt with before talking about the future. So just to show you a little bit, and I'm going to take only, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes more to try to tell you a little bit about this. The process of memory, truth, and justice in Argentina was long after this 1976-83 dictatorship. And we have a process of in the 80s, there was a first moment in which justice was approached by means of a historical trial that maybe you can see in a movie, which is very popular and almost won the Oscar, but didn't. 1985 Argentina, which I recommend. I think it's very interesting with all of these failings and successes at the same time. But in the 80s, we had a chance to do justice, and it was very important. But at the same time, in the late 80s and early 90s, there were executive pardons. And the idea was to try to introduce this policy of reconciliation. This lasted during the 90s, which was very difficult to endure, but the human rights movement. But the human rights movements did many things internationally and fostered changes that finally derived in an openness and reopening of the process of memory, truth, and justice from 2001 to 2005. Finally, the Supreme Court reopened the process of judiciary trials regarding human rights violations. And today we have trials concerning dictatorship, human rights violations in Argentina. We have many trials going on right now in Argentina since the beginning of the 2000s up to now. So the process I'm going to discuss is not the past, it's the present for us, you know? And you can read these trials, you can see them online, many of them, and they're happening right now. And they're amazing in terms of understanding what happened in this country and about hearing voices over there. In this process, which is very complex, the issue of business involvement and repression of the working class was present from the beginning. Even during the dictatorship, there were many international denunciations, but in the National Commission of the Disappearance of People in 1984, the junta's trial in 1985, during the 80s, during the 90s, there were many evidence displayed in different arenas, legal arenas, regarding the repression against the working class and the labor movement. And so this is an issue that started to become increasingly important during this process of memory, truth, and justice in Argentina. And here you have some pictures of workers disappeared, of employers that had been prosecuted because of these crimes, and organizations of workers and trade unions. And here are the trials in which there are evidences of corporate involvement in Argentina today. So all of these cases, we are talking about a huge issue. Not only the process of criminal trials is going on in Argentina, but we do have all of these cases in court related to corporate involvement. And I'm going to just to talk about two of them. La Veloz del Norte, that's a transportation company. The owner was convicted in 2016. Then the following legal chamber considered that it was not proven that there were human rights violations, so they discarded this conviction in 2017, and the Supreme Court reinstated, considered that it was definitely human rights violations and asked for a new verdict right now. And we have another case, which is the case of Ford Motor Argentina, where two main executives were found guilty along with one military in 2018. And this verdict was confirmed by this legal chamber that has to oversee the second step of the process. So what we have in the case of Ford Motor Argentina, it was a case that showed in the oral proceedings that took place from December 2017 to December 2018, all of the aspects I was mentioning before. No, we have 24 workers that were kidnapped. 17 of them were kidnapped at the shop floor from their working positions. And the trial that lasted a year had a lot of publicity, and each of the audiences of the trial were extremely important. Here you have some of the flyers over here, no? So women took the stand, and many workers and witnesses were illustrating different aspects. just to tell you about the importance of documents made by the companies themselves, here we have a propaganda made by Ford in the 1970s, which says, "Punish me, mistreat me, starve me to death, and exploit me. I'm all yours, Falcon." No, so many of these kind of, which is, I don't know, another Ford advertisement in the 70s through a van, through a pickup from a plane, which was the way in which military disposed of many of the bodies in Argentina, throwing the bodies from the plane. No, so this advertising was just to show how the pickup would resist to be thrown out of a plane. So I don't know, all of these sources about the companies themselves and the way in which they place themselves in the discussion and the public sphere, I think it's worth a lot more than I can afford right now. Also, during the trial, we worked with plans. We worked with maps, schematics of the company to try to understand the facts and the ways in which to try to understand the factories as a place of repression was very important, And here you have located, you have marked here the way that was used as a clandestine detention center within the factory, no? So you can see how workers had to pass over there and how this place used to be a recreation space that workers had conquered after a struggle, no? Of course, also the importance of trade union struggle and the fight for rights over there, and conditions of work, working conditions, and health was very important. And during the trial, the members of court were brought to the police precincts where these workers had been jailed, and also to the factory. So workers could show the judges what had happened in the real space in which the actions took place, which was very amazing. And now the Argentinian TV is airing a documentary about this trial, and is showing images of this process of visiting the factory and all of this and that I'm telling you about. So you can see the documentary, and I can send you the link. And also, it was very important, the testimonies of the wives and families showing all of this evidence that I was referring to before, this list with the logo of Ford, with the names of the employees that were going to be kidnapped, the ways in which the military told them, well, it's not us, I have nothing against your husband, just the company asked me to kidnap him, And also, the trial was very, very important in terms of showing the community impact that this had, the voices of the children of these workers, 24 workers and shop stewards, showed that the repression not only affected them, the right to live, because they were kidnapped and endure terrible torture. Many of them have health problems until today because of what happened. And of course, they couldn't find work when they got out because they were blacklisted. And there was huge persecution by other means. For example, they had what is called like a controlled freedom after they were released. And police would go to their places and check whether or not they were there, and checked on them and surveilled them for many, many years, even to the end of the dictatorship. But also the ensuing generations, So the children were completely affected by this. They had to go to jail to see their parents when they were legalized, because before they had been in police precincts in an illegal form, and eventually they were brought to jail. And jails were also a structure of violence, You had to go in and you were searched violently, and subjected to these horrible situations. No, so the voice of children was also very, very important. And the other thing is that in the trial there were expert witnesses. I was one of the witnesses. Here you see also Eduardo Basualdo, Federico Bocos, and Silvio Feldman. Other experts were called to testify within the trial, which is very hard. I don't know, I've done it in several cases and occasions, in many of the cases we've seen in the map, but it's quite difficult. It's something that you have to learn. You have to understand how the trial works and what's your place over there, and to find a way to reconcile the academic work with this kind of activity, which is not easy at all. But at the same time, it gives the judges an opportunity to try to place these events in a wider picture and to try to understand some of the relationships and connections that are not always as visible. No, this is the day of the verdict. In 2018, it was amazing. It was a moment of an incredible moment. I couldn't believe that the outcome was a conviction not only of the military responsible, but of the two of the business officials. And here you have the convicted, the responsible. This is it was the chief of security of Ford Motor Company, Héctor Sibila, and this is his lawyer. And there was a huge mobilization around this. This trial made headlines around the world. Here you have the New York Times, Le Monde, El País, The Guardian, but also, I don't know, not only in Latin America, Mexico, Folia Sao Paulo, but also Japan Times, Kathmandu Tribune, Taiwan News. It was all over the world. And in Argentina, there was almost no repercussion because of the importance of these companies and their influence over media. So this is another thing to take into account. Also, this brought together a process of mobilization. Here we have the workers on March 24, 2018, marching with all of their families, their sons and daughters, but also grandsons and granddaughters. And it was an amazing process in which many of the things that had to be hidden before were brought into the light. And also the role of women was something very important in all this process. Usually this idea that it's men, that men are the workers at the center of all this process, and all this trial brought to light the role of women and the role of the community as a whole in all this process, and made possible to underline other aspects. Also, I wanted to say that the relationship between research and this process of memory, truth, and justice also was related to a creation of a special unity of research of human rights crime with economic motivation, which is a very important thing. This unit had been created in 2010, had been deactivated by Macri administration, and was reopened and fostered since 2020 onwards. And also there are very important projects underway. I just wanted to mention in Argentina a very important agreement between the Human Rights Secretary and the CONICET to research about this process, but also in Brazil, the project corporate responsibility for human rights violations during the dictatorship, in which 13 cases are being researched right now. And these results are going to be presented to the public during this year. And I think it's going to be a major contribution from Brazil as well. So I'm just going to close it here. Sorry, I took a few more minutes, but I wanted just to finish this, and I'm very much looking forward to listen to you.